This is The Telltale Heart: Crime, Guilt, and Confession. Part 1. The Real Telltale Heart. The 1830 Murder That Haunted Poe. Chapter 1. The secret which the murderer possesses soon comes to possess him. He feels it beating at his heart, rising to his throat, and demanding disclosure. Those words were not written by Edgar Allan Poe. They were spoken in a Salem courtroom in 1930 by Senator Daniel Webster, prosecuting the murder of an old man killed in his bed while moonlight fell upon his grey hair. 13 years later, Poe published The Telltale Heart. Scholars have been tracing the connection ever since. This is the true story of Captain Joseph White, bludgeoned and stabbed 13 times in his own bed. A family conspiracy, a hired killer, and a courtroom speech so haunting that its language migrated directly into American literature. This is the murder that created The Telltale Heart. Chapter 2. The Victim. Captain Joseph White had lived a long life, and not always an honourable one. He'd made his fortune in the East India trade, sailing the routes that built the New England's wealth in the early days of the American Republic. But whispers followed him through the decades. He'd been involved in the slave trade, something even his contemporaries found distasteful, despite how many of their own fortunes were built on that same blood money. By 1830, White was 82 years old, a widower living in a grand Federation-style mansion on the Essex Street in Salem, Massachusetts. By 1830, White was 82 years old, a widower living in a grand Federation-style mansion on Essex Street in Salem, Massachusetts. The Gardner-Pinger House, which still stands today. His wife, Elizabeth, had died 8 years earlier. They had no children together, so White did what wealthy men without heirs often do. He used his fortune as a weapon, constantly revising his will, keeping family members in line with the promise or threat of inheritance. The house was large and quiet. Living with him was his niece, Mrs. Mary Beckford, who served as his housekeeper. She managed the domestic affairs while the old captain managed his money and his grudges in equal measure. Mrs. Beckford's daughter had married a young man named Joseph Knapp Jr. And here is where our story takes on its dark turn, because Joseph Knapp Jr. was exactly the kind of man that Captain White despised. The old captain saw him as a fortune hunter, a ne'er-do-well who'd married into the family with his eyes firmly fixed on inheritance. White had already written Mrs. Beckford out of his will once, furious at the marriage. The family dynamics were poisonous with resentment. Calculation, and barely concealed hostility. And Joseph Knapp Jr. decided to do something about it. Chapter 3. The Plot. Knapp's plan was brutally simple in its greed and complex in its execution. He believed that if Captain White died without a valid will, the estate would pass to Mrs. Beckford through interstate succession. The laws governing inheritance when no will exists, and from Mrs. Beckford, the money would flow to her daughter, Knapp's wife. So the will had to disappear, and the old man had to die. A few days before the murder, Knapp snuck into Captain White's house. He knew his way around. He was family after all, however unwelcome. He stole what he believed was the current will from the captain's iron safe. He then unlatched the back parlour window from the inside, leaving it ready to be opened from without. The stage was set. For the killing itself, Knapp turned to the Crowninshield brothers, Richard and George, members of another prominent Salem family, but ones who had fallen far from respectability. They had descended into gambling, drinking, and associations that polite Salem society preferred not to acknowledge. Richard Crowninshield agreed to commit the murder. The price was $1,000. On the night of April 6, 1830, the plan went into motion. Mrs. Beckford was conveniently away in Wenham, staying with her daughter and son-in-law, which was Knapp himself. The house on Essex Street was quiet. Captain White, an old man who valued his rest, retired to bed as he always did. He would not wake again. Chapter 4. The Murder. What happened next would later be reconstructed in horrifying detail by Daniel Webster during the trial. Listen to his words, and as you do, think about Poe's narrator creeping into that old man's chamber 13 years later in fiction. Deep sleep had fallen on the destined victim, and on all beneath his roof. A healthful old man to whom sleep was sweet. The first sound slumbers of the night held him in their soft but strong embrace. Webster continued. The assassin enters, through the window already prepared, into an unoccupied apartment. With noiseless foot he paces the lonely hall. Half lighted by the moon, he winds up the ascent of stairs and reaches the door of the chamber. And then the room is uncommonly open to the admission of light. The face of the innocent sleeper is turned from the murderer, and the beams of the moon resting on the grey locks of his aged temple show him where to strike. The grey locks of his aged temple, the beams of the moon, the assassin knowing precisely where to strike. If these images feel familiar, it's because Poe would use nearly identical imagery 13 years later. Richard Crowninshield struck Captain White with a specifically made club, fracturing his skull. But he wasn't finished. He stabbed the old man 13 times with a long dirk, a dagger, piercing his heart. Webster would note with grim precision, he even raised the aged arm, that he may not fail in his aim at the heart, and replaces it again over the wounds. Then, like a physician checking his work, Crowninshield felt the old man's wrist for a pulse. Finding none, he retreated through the window and disappeared into the April night. Outside in darkness, the Knapp brothers waited. The deed was done. The secret was theirs, or so they believed. Chapter 5. The Unravelling. Salem erupted. An elderly citizen of good standing, murdered in his own bed. The town formed a committee of vigilance. Rewards were posted. Suspicion fell everywhere and nowhere. In a community where everyone knew everyone else's business, suddenly no one seemed to know anything at all. The Knapp brothers played their roles perfectly, at least at first. Joseph Knapp Jr. attended Captain White's funeral and made a very convincing show of grief. The brothers even appeared before the Committee of Vigilance with an outlandish story. They claimed they'd been robbed on the road home from Salem by 3 masked men who stole a trunk from their carriage. It was a clumsy attempt to create alternative suspects, an obvious fiction that would later damn them when the truth finally emerged. The break in the case came from an unexpected direction. A man named John Palmer had been staying at the Crowninshield house and had overheard the brothers discussing the murder plot. When Palmer found himself in financial difficulty, as men of his sort often did, he saw an opportunity. He wrote an extortion letter to Joseph Knapp Sr., the brother's father, demanding $350 and threatening to expose what he knew. Now, the Committee of Vigilance intercepted the letter. They sent $50 to the address with a promise of more and watched to see who collected it. Palmer was arrested, and when faced with the consequences of his attempted blackmail, he talked. The Knapp brothers were arrested. Under the pressure of confinement, separated from each other and from every hope of escape, Joseph Knapp Jr. cracked. He confessed everything: the plot, the stolen will, the hired killer, the unlatched window. But then Richard Crowninshield, the actual murderer, did something that threatened to destroy the entire prosecution. He hanged himself in his cell. Chapter 6. Daniel Webster and the Power of Guilt. Crownshield's suicide created a legal crisis of the first order. Under Massachusetts law in 1830, you couldn't convict an accessory to murder unless the principal, the actual killer, had first been convicted. With Crowninshield dead by his own hand, it seemed that the Knapp brothers might literally get away with murder. The man who had struck the blows and thrust the dagger was beyond the reach of earthly justice. How could his accomplices be punished? Enter Daniel Webster. Webster was already one of the most famous men in America, a senator, a legendary orator whose speeches were studied and memorized, a future Secretary of State. The wealthy families of Salem, horrified by the murder and determined to see justice done, pooled their resources and convinced Webster to lead the prosecution. His fee, $1,000, by dark coincidence, the same amount the Knapps paid Richard Crowninshield to commit the murder. Webster's challenge was immense. He had to convince the jury that Frank Knapp, Joseph's brother, who had merely stood lookout in the street while Crowninshield committed the murder inside the house, was legally a principal to the crime, not just an accessory. The distinction was everything. An accessory could not be convicted without the principal, but a principal could be tried and hanged on his own. To make this argument, Webster had to paint a picture so vivid, so morally compelling, that the jury would feel the weight of guilt as if it were pressing on their own chests. He had to make them understand that standing watch while murder is committed is not mere assistance, it is participation. It is partnership in blood. What Webster delivered was one of the greatest speeches in American
When we
legal
turn to the
history.
case, gentlemen,
And it was,
we are
scholars
met with
now
a
believe,
crime
the
as it
direct
has proceeded,
inspiration of
remorseless
the telltale heart.
yet cowardly.
Listen to
When we
Webster
turn to the
describe
case,
how
gentlemen,
guilt consumes
we are
a
met
killer.
with a crime as it
The
has
guilty soul
proceeded,
cannot
remorseless
keep its own
yet
secret.
cowardly.
It is false
When we turn to the
to
case,
itself,
gentlemen,
or
we
rather,
are met with a
it feels an
crime as it has
irresistible
proceeded,
impulse of conscience to
remorseless
be true
yet
to itself.
cowardly.
It
When we turn
labours
to the case,
under its
gentlemen,
guilty
we are
possession
met with a
and
crime
knows not
as it
what
has
to do with it.
proceeded,
He
remorseless
continued,
yet
the
cowardly.
human heart was not made for the residence of such an inhabitant. It finds itself preyed upon by torment, which dares not acknowledge to God or man. A vulture is devouring it. It can ask no sympathy or assistance, either from heaven or earth. And further, the secret which murderer possesses soon comes to possess him. And like evil spirits of which we read, it overcomes him and leads him whithersoever it will. And then the passage that reads almost like the first draft of Poe's masterpiece. He feels it beating at his heart, rising to his throat, demanding disclosure. He thinks the whole world sees it in his face, reads it in his eyes, and almost hears its workings in the very silence of his thought. It becomes his master. Beating at his heart, rising to his throat, demanding disclosure, the whole world seeing his guilt. These aren't merely similar themes to the telltale heart, they are the very same themes, expressed in nearly the same language. Chapter 7, Justice and Legacy. Webster won. The jury convicted Frank Knapp, accepting the argument that serving as a lookout made him principal to the murder, not merely an accessory. On September 28, 1830, Frank Knapp was hanged in front of Salem jail before a crowd estimated at 3,000 to 5,000 people. A substantial portion of the town's population gathered to witness the wages of conspiracy and murder. His brother Joseph, who had confessed and then desperately recanted when he realized his confession wouldn't save him from the gallows, was tried separately. He too was convicted and hanged on New Year's Eve in 1830. The year ended as it had begun, in blood and retribution. George Crowninshield, Richard's brother, managed to establish an alibi. He'd been with prostitutes at a gambling house on the night of the murder. Not the most respectable defense, but an effective one, and he was eventually acquitted. Now, the case made international headlines. Webster's speech was published as a pamphlet and became required reading in courses on American rhetoric. Every law student, every aspiring orator, every citizen interested in the power of language encountered those words about guilt and secrecy and the heart's inability to contain a terrible knowledge. Nathaniel Hawthorne, who lived in Salem and knew some of the accused, would draw on these cases for his own explorations of hidden guilt in works like The Scarlet Letter and Edgar Allan Poe. In 1830, he was a 21-year-old just entering West Point, which he would leave within a year to pursue his literary ambitions. We don't know if he followed the trial as it happened. The newspaper carried the story far and wide, so he may well have. But by 1843, when he published The Telltale Heart, he had clearly absorbed Webster's speech. Poe scholar T.O. Mabbutt has written that Poe relied critically on Webster's summation in writing the story. Think about the parallels. An old man murdered in his bed while he sleeps, a killer who enters with calculated stealth, moonlight illuminating the victim's space, a murderer undone not by evidence, not by witnesses, not by detective work or of investigators, but by the unbearable weight of his own guilt. The secret that demands disclosure, the pressure that beats at the heart and rises to the throat until it must be confessed. Poe transformed the facts into fiction. He gave us an unreliable narrator who insists on his own sanity while describing his madness. He replaced the hired killer with a caretaker obsessed with the old man's pale blue eye. He made the beating heart into something that hovers between the supernatural and the psychological. We never know if the narrator truly hears the heartbeat or if it is the sound of his own guilty conscience amplified beyond endurance. But the core truth remains the same, the truth that Daniel Webster articulated in that Salem courtroom. The human heart was not made for the residence of such an inhabitant. Murder will out, not because of detectives or evidence of forensic science, but because the guilty soul cannot keep its own secret. The Gardner Pingree House still stands at 28 Essex Street in Salem. You can visit the room where Captain Joseph White drew his last breath, where moonlight fell on his grey hair, where a murder was committed that would echo through American literature for centuries to come. And next time you read The Telltale Heart, listen for Daniel Webster's voice beyond Poe's words. Listen for the real secret beating beneath the floorboards of fiction. But guilt doesn't always manifest as sound. Sometimes it rises through the very ground beneath your feet.